The sound of sirens pierces through the quiet suburban night. Red and blue lights flash against the windows of a two-story colonial home on Maple Street. It's 2:47 a.m. Just hours after prom, 17-year-old Marcus Thompson should be home asleep, dreaming about his future. Instead, flashing red and blue lights surround his house as he's rushed to the hospital. His body burning with fever, his life unraveling because of a secret no one saw coming. A secret that would shatter his family and end in cold-blooded murder. What happened in the hours after prom would expose a secret so devastating that it would destroy a family, shock a community, and ultimately end in cold-blooded murder. Tonight we uncover the twisted relationship between a stepson and his stepmother that turned a night of celebration into a nightmare of betrayal. The truth about what really happened will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about trust, family, and the people closest to us. This is not just a story about a crime. This is a story about how far someone will go to protect a lie and how that lie became a death sentence. Before we continue with this shocking story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Marcus Thompson was everything a small-town kid should be. Honor roll student, varsity track runner, working part-time at his uncle's auto shop to save money for college. He lived in the picturesque town of Millfield with his father David, a respected electrician, and his stepmother Rebecca, who everyone knew as the woman who brought light back into David's life after his first wife died in a car accident when Marcus was just 12. On the surface, they were the perfect blended family. Rebecca volunteered at the church bake sales, attended Marcus's track meets, and seemed to genuinely care about the boy who had lost his mother too young. But beneath this facade of normalcy, something much darker was taking root. By the end of this story, you'll discover how a prom night celebration became the catalyst for revealing a secret that would cost Marcus everything. You'll learn why a woman who promised to protect a grieving child became his predator. And you'll understand how betrayal, when mixed with desperation, can turn deadly. The questions that haunted investigators for months were simple, yet chilling. How does a mother figure destroy the very child she's supposed to protect? Why did Marcus have to die to keep her secret safe? And could this tragedy have been prevented if anyone had seen the warning signs? Marcus Thompson wasn't supposed to be at Millfield High School's senior prom alone, but his girlfriend Emily had come down with the flu 2 days before the big night. Most kids would have skipped it entirely, but Marcus had been looking forward to this night for months. He'd saved up from his job at Thompson Auto Repair, owned by his uncle, not his father, to rent a navy blue tuxedo that made him look older than his 17 years. His friends Jake and Carlos had convinced him to come anyway, promising they'd make sure he had a good time. Marcus was the kind of kid who made friends easily. His teachers described him as quietly confident, the type of student who helped struggling classmates with math homework and never made them feel stupid for needing help. He carried himself with the slight awkwardness of someone who'd grown 4 inches in the past year, but his genuine smile and tendency to listen more than he talked made him popular with both his peers and adults. David Thompson had done his best to raise Marcus alone after his wife Sarah died in a head-on collision with a drunk driver on Interstate 95. For 3 years, father and son had navigated grief together, eating too much takeout and learning to do laundry the hard way. David worked long hours as an electrical contractor, often leaving Marcus to fend for himself after school, but the bond between them was strong. Marcus inherited his father's work ethic and his mother's compassionate nature, creating a young man who seemed destined for good things. When David met Rebecca Walsh at a church singles event in 2019, Marcus was 15 and initially suspicious of any woman who might try to replace his mother. But Rebecca was patient, kind, and never pushed too hard for Marcus's acceptance. She was 34, 8 years younger than David, with auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to light up when she laughed. She'd moved to Millfield from Atlanta after a messy divorce, claiming she wanted a fresh start in a smaller town where people still knew their neighbors. Rebecca integrated herself into their lives gradually. She started by bringing dinner over on weekends when David was working late, claiming she'd made too much for just herself. She attended Marcus's track meets, cheering louder than some of the actual parents. When David and Rebecca married in a small ceremony at First Baptist Church in the summer of 2020, Marcus walked her down the aisle, symbolically giving his blessing to the union. The gesture made the local newspaper's social section with the headline, "Blended Family Finds New Beginnings." For nearly 2 years, everything seemed perfect. Rebecca maintained the house with an attention to detail that impressed the neighborhood wives. She planted flower gardens that bloomed in carefully orchestrated succession throughout the growing season. She hosted barbecues that brought together David's work friends and their families. She even helped Marcus with his college applications, researching scholarship opportunities and proofreading his essays. But there were moments, small at first, when something felt off. Marcus's friend Jake later told investigators about times when Rebecca would touch Marcus's shoulder for just a moment too long, or how she'd find excuses to be in his room when he was doing homework. There were the text messages that started innocuously enough, reminding him about doctor's appointments or asking if he needed anything from the grocery store, but gradually became more frequent and personal. She'd ask about girls he liked, offering advice about dating that made him uncomfortable. When Marcus turned 17 in March, Rebecca gave him a gift that surprised everyone, an expensive watch that seemed too intimate for a stepmother to give. David had seemed pleased, proud that his wife cared so much about his son, but Marcus felt something was wrong with the gesture. He couldn't articulate what bothered him about it, so he said nothing. The warning signs were there, hidden in plain sight like they so often are. Rebecca had begun staying up late, claiming insomnia, and would often be in the kitchen when Marcus came home from his evening shifts at the auto shop. She'd offer him leftover dinner and want to talk about his day, his friends, his dreams. These conversations felt different from the casual check-ins of his early childhood, or even the awkward getting-to-know-you period when she first joined their family. There was an intensity to her attention that made Marcus uncomfortable, but he attributed it to her trying too hard to be a good stepmother. He'd lost his mother so young that he had no real reference point for what a normal mother-son relationship should look like as he approached adulthood. Rebecca's interest in his life felt suffocating at times, but Marcus convinced himself that this was just what having a mother figure was supposed to feel like. He couldn't have known that Rebecca was grooming him, slowly breaking down boundaries and normalizing inappropriate intimacy. He couldn't have known that her late-night availability wasn't maternal concern, but predatory calculation. And he certainly couldn't have known that behind her perfect stepmother facade, Rebecca was hiding a devastating secret that would change everything. Millfield High School's 2022 senior prom was held at the Grandview Country Club, a sprawling venue 20 minutes outside of town that the school had booked for the past 15 years. The theme was Midnight in Paris, and the decorating committee had transformed the ballroom with twinkling lights and artificial Eiffel Tower centerpieces that looked more impressive in the dim lighting than they probably should have. Marcus arrived at 7:30 with Jake and Carlos, all 3 boys in matching navy tuxedos they'd rented from the same shop. Despite Emily's absence, Marcus found himself having a good time. He danced with Sarah Mitchell, Jake's date's best friend, and even worked up the courage to ask Amanda Rogers, the quiet girl from his AP history class, for a slow dance during the last song. The photography showed Marcus laughing, his face relaxed and genuinely happy in a way that his friends would remember when everything fell apart. The original plan had been for Marcus to spend the night at Jake's house with a group of friends, but at 10:30, as the dance was winding down, Marcus received a text from Rebecca. His phone lit up with her message. "Your dad had to respond to an emergency call at the Henderson construction site. I'm coming to pick you up instead. Meet me in the parking lot in 15 minutes. Marcus showed the message to Jake and Carlos, who were disappointed but understood. David often had to work late when electrical problems arose at construction sites, and it made sense that Rebecca would step in. Marcus gathered his things, said goodbye to his friends, and walked out to the country club's parking lot to wait. He stood under one of the decorative lampposts, checking his phone and enjoying the cool spring air after hours in the stuffy ballroom. Rebecca's silver Honda Accord pulled up at exactly 11 o'clock. She was dressed more casually than Marcus had expected, wearing jeans and a fitted black sweater instead of her usual put-together appearance. Her makeup was heavier than normal, and there was something in her demeanor that felt different, more energetic and confident than her usual measured approach. "How was the dance?" she asked as Marcus climbed into the passenger seat, but her tone suggested she was distracted by other thoughts. Marcus buckled his seatbelt and began telling her about the evening, about dancing with Sarah, and how the decorations had actually looked pretty good, but Rebecca seemed to only half listen. Instead of taking the direct route home down Oak Street, she turned onto the winding back roads that led toward the lake on the other side of town. "Where are we going?" Marcus asked, confused by the detour. "I thought we could stop somewhere and talk," Rebecca said, her voice taking on a quality that Marcus had never heard before. "You're graduating in 3 weeks, heading to college in the fall. We never really get time alone together, just the two of us." Something about the way she said "alone together" made Marcus's stomach tighten with unease. He suggested they could talk at home, but Rebecca shook her head, saying his father wouldn't be back until very late and they had plenty of time. She pulled into the parking area at Miller's Lake, a secluded spot popular with teenagers but empty on this weeknight. The moon reflected off the water, creating an almost romantic atmosphere that made Marcus deeply uncomfortable. Rebecca turned off the engine but left the radio playing softly, some slow song he didn't recognize. "Marcus," she said, turning to face him in the driver's seat, "you know I care about you, right? You know you can trust me with anything." What happened next in that car would haunt Marcus for the rest of his short life. Rebecca began talking about how handsome he looked in his tuxedo, how proud she was of the young man he'd become, how she'd noticed girls at school looking at him with interest. Her words were inappropriate, but it was her actions that crossed every line imaginable. She reached over and touched his face, telling him he reminded her of his father when David was younger. Marcus tried to pull away, but Rebecca moved closer, saying she wanted to show him how much she cared about him. The details of what followed are too disturbing to describe in full, but what's important to understand is that Marcus, despite being 17 and physically capable of resistance, was completely unprepared for this betrayal by the woman he'd trusted as a mother figure. Rebecca used her position of authority, her knowledge of his insecurities, and his natural confusion about physical intimacy to manipulate him into a situation that would destroy his life. Marcus would later tell a crisis counselor that the worst part wasn't the physical violation, though that was traumatic enough. The worst part was how Rebecca framed what happened, telling him it was natural, that it was what people who cared about each other did, that it was their special secret that would bring them closer as a family. She drove him home afterward as if nothing had happened, chatting about his upcoming graduation and making plans for a family celebration. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, his formal wear feeling like a costume now, his mind reeling with confusion and shame. When they arrived home, David's truck was already in the driveway. "Remember," Rebecca said as they walked to the front door, "this is just between us. Your father wouldn't understand." The implied threat in her words was clear. Speaking up would destroy not just Rebecca, but David and the family they'd worked so hard to build. Marcus went to his room that night and didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened, trying to understand how the woman who'd attended his track meets and helped him with college applications could do something so awful to him. He thought about calling Jake or Carlos, but what would he say? He thought about confronting Rebecca, but she'd made it clear that speaking up would have consequences. Most devastatingly, he thought about telling his father, but the idea of destroying David's happiness, of tearing apart their family again, felt impossible. Marcus was trapped by his own compassion, his desire to protect the people he loved, and his inability to comprehend that he was not responsible for Rebecca's actions. He fell asleep as dawn was breaking, exhausted and traumatized, believing that he was somehow complicit in his own abuse. He had no way of knowing that Rebecca had been planning this for months, waiting for the right opportunity to act on desires that had nothing to do with love or care and everything to do with power and control. If you're still watching, drop a comment with the word "still here." Let's see how many of you are locked into this story. 3 days after prom, Marcus woke up feeling like he was coming down with the flu. His body ached, he had a low-grade fever, and he felt exhausted despite sleeping more than usual. Rebecca suggested he stay home from school, bringing him soup and checking on him with the same maternal concern she'd always shown. But there was something different in her attention now, a possessiveness that made Marcus's skin crawl. She would sit on the edge of his bed longer than necessary, touching his forehead to check for fever with hands that lingered too long. When David asked about Marcus's illness, Rebecca was quick to reassure him that it was probably just stress from upcoming finals and graduation. She volunteered to take Marcus to the doctor if he didn't improve, an offer that terrified Marcus for reasons he couldn't articulate. By Friday, Marcus felt worse instead of better. He'd developed a persistent cough and night sweats that left his sheets soaked. His lymph nodes were swollen, and he had a rash on his chest that looked like nothing he'd ever seen before. Rebecca drove him to Dr. Patterson's office, insisting on coming into the examination room with him despite Marcus's protests that he was old enough to see the doctor alone. Dr. Patterson, who'd known Marcus since childhood, noted the symptoms and asked standard questions about recent activities, stress levels, and potential exposure to illness. When he asked if Marcus was sexually active, Rebecca answered for him, saying no, absolutely not, and Marcus was too confused and ashamed to correct her. Dr. Patterson prescribed rest and fluids, suggesting it was likely a viral infection that would resolve itself. But Marcus didn't get better. Over the following week, his symptoms worsened dramatically. The fever spiked higher, he lost his appetite entirely, and he began having trouble concentrating during his few attempts to attend school. His friend Jake noticed the change immediately. "Dude, you look terrible," Jake said during lunch on Tuesday. "Like, really sick. Maybe you should go to the hospital." Marcus brushed off the concern, but privately he was beginning to panic. Something was seriously wrong with him, and the timing felt too coincidental to ignore. The symptoms had started exactly 3 days after prom night, exactly 3 days after Rebecca had... He couldn't even think about what had happened without feeling sick to his stomach. Emily Rodriguez, who'd finally recovered from her own bout with the flu, stopped by Marcus's house on Wednesday evening to check on him. She was shocked by his appearance. Marcus had lost noticeable weight, his skin had a grayish pallor, and he seemed to be shivering despite the warm May weather. "Marcus, you need to go to the emergency room," Emily insisted. "This isn't normal sick. This is something else." Rebecca, who'd answered the door and hovered nearby during their conversation, quickly disagreed. She assured Emily that Marcus was just run down from the stress of senior year and would be fine with more rest. But Emily's visit planted a seed of courage in Marcus. Someone outside his family had noticed how sick he was, had validated that his symptoms were serious. Maybe it was time to speak up. That night, Marcus called Jake from his bedroom phone, speaking in whispers even though his father was working late again. "I need to tell you something," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "But you have to promise not to tell anyone until I figure out what to do," Jake promised, and Marcus took a deep breath before saying the words that would change everything. "Rebecca did something to me, after prom, in the car, and I think she made me sick." The conversation lasted 2 hours, with Jake listening in shocked silence as Marcus described what had happened. Jake's initial reaction was disbelief. Rebecca seemed so normal, so caring, but as Marcus continued talking, providing details that no 17-year-old should know about adult sexuality, Jake realized his friend was telling the truth. Jake convinced Marcus to talk to his older sister Maria, who was a nurse at the county hospital. Maria listened to Marcus's story with professional calm, asking gentle questions about his symptoms and the timeline of events. When Marcus described the night sweats, swollen lymph nodes, and persistent fever, Maria felt a chill of recognition. "Marcus," she said carefully, "I think you need to get tested for some things, specific things, and I think you need to tell your dad what happened." Marcus begged Maria not to say anything, terrified of destroying his family, but Maria explained that some secrets were too dangerous to keep. She offered to help him tell David, to be there for support. And slowly Marcus began to realize that he wasn't alone in this nightmare. The confrontation with David happened on a Saturday morning in late May. Marcus had asked his father to sit down in the living room, saying he had something important to discuss. Rebecca was at the farmer's market, giving them privacy that Marcus desperately needed. With Maria sitting beside him for support, Marcus looked at his father and said, "Dad, something happened on prom night, something bad, with Rebecca." The words tumbled out in a rush, punctuated by tears and apologies, as Marcus described the betrayal that had destroyed his sense of safety and trust. David's reaction was immediate and visceral. He stood up, paced the room, and then sat down heavily, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, anger, and heartbreak. "Are you absolutely certain?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. When Marcus nodded, David closed his eyes and said, "We're going to the police, right now." The investigation that followed moved quickly. Detective Sarah Walsh, no relation to Rebecca, was a 15-year veteran of the county sheriff's department with specialized training in sexual assault cases. She interviewed Marcus in a comfortable room at the station, with Maria present as his advocate. Marcus's story was detailed, consistent, and heartbreaking. Detective Walsh explained that they would need medical evidence and that Marcus would have to undergo testing that might be uncomfortable but was necessary for building a case. Marcus agreed, knowing that staying silent would only protect Rebecca and potentially put other young people at risk. The medical examination confirmed what Maria had suspected. Marcus had contracted a sexually transmitted infection that typically showed symptoms within days of exposure. Further testing would reveal the full scope of what Rebecca had done to him. When Detective Walsh obtained a warrant for Rebecca's medical records, the investigation took a devastating turn. Rebecca had been diagnosed with HIV 3 years earlier, during the final stages of her marriage in Atlanta. She'd been receiving treatment and her viral load was suppressed, but she'd never disclosed her status to David or anyone else in Millfield. The implications were staggering. Not only had Rebecca sexually assaulted her stepson, but she'd potentially exposed him to a life-threatening virus. The charges against her would include sexual assault, reckless endangerment, and criminal transmission of HIV. Detective Walsh had seen many difficult cases in her career, but the calculated nature of Rebecca's actions, the grooming, the manipulation, the complete betrayal of trust, made this one of the worst. Rebecca's arrest took place on a Tuesday morning as she was leaving for her shift at the local library where she volunteered. The sight of patrol cars in their driveway sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Rebecca maintained her innocence, claiming Marcus was lying, that he was angry about some imagined slight and was trying to destroy her marriage to his father. She hired an expensive lawyer from the state capitol and prepared to fight the charges aggressively. Meanwhile, Marcus faced the dual trauma of dealing with his assault and learning that he might be HIV positive. The waiting period for conclusive test results felt endless, each day bringing new anxiety about his health and his future. David struggled with his own guilt and rage, blaming himself for not seeing the signs, for bringing a predator into his son's life. The family that had seemed so perfect just weeks earlier was now completely shattered. The community of Millfield rallied around Marcus and David in the weeks following Rebecca's arrest. The high school principal arranged for Marcus to complete his coursework from home so he could graduate with his class. Local businesses donated money for his legal and medical expenses. The pastor at First Baptist Church, where Rebecca had been such an active member, struggled to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the monster revealed by the investigation. But not everyone believed Marcus's story. Some neighbors whispered that teenage boys couldn't really be victims, that Marcus must have been a willing participant who was now trying to avoid consequences. These cruel whispers reached Marcus's ears and added another layer of trauma to his already overwhelming situation. On June 15th, exactly 1 month after prom night, Marcus received the news he'd been dreading. He had tested positive for HIV. Dr. Sarah Chen, an infectious disease specialist brought in from the State Medical Center, explained that with modern treatments, HIV was no longer the death sentence it had once been. Marcus could live a normal lifespan with proper medication and monitoring. But at 17, facing his senior year of high school and college applications, the diagnosis felt devastating. Marcus looked at his father, sitting beside him in the sterile medical office, and saw his own despair reflected in David's eyes. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered, though he had nothing to apologize for. "I'm so sorry this happened to our family." Rebecca's lawyer fought hard to discredit Marcus's testimony, suggesting that the teenager was confused about what had happened or was lying to get attention. The defense strategy was as cruel as it was predictable: blame the victim, question his credibility, and suggest that any sexual contact had been consensual. Rebecca herself maintained her innocence, even when confronted with DNA evidence and her own medical records. During a pre-trial hearing, she looked directly at Marcus and said, "I loved you like my own son. I can't believe you're doing this to me." The manipulation continued even from jail, as Rebecca wrote letters to David begging him to believe her, claiming that Marcus was troubled and had initiated everything that happened. The case received significant media attention, with news vans parked outside the courthouse and reporters trying to interview anyone connected to the family. The local newspaper ran a series of articles about HIV criminalization laws and the complexities of prosecuting sexual assault cases involving teenage victims and adult authority figures. Legal experts weighed in on the charges, with some arguing that Rebecca's actions constituted attempted murder, given her knowledge of her HIV status, and others contending that the prosecution was overreaching. For Marcus, the media circus was another layer of trauma. His private nightmare had become public entertainment, with strangers debating the details of the worst experience of his life. As the trial date approached, Marcus's behavior began to worry his father and his therapist. The confident, optimistic young man who'd walked into prom night was gone, replaced by someone who was anxious, depressed, and increasingly isolated. Marcus had nightmares every night, often waking up screaming Rebecca's name. He stopped eating regularly and lost dangerous amounts of weight. His friends tried to maintain contact, but Marcus pushed them away, convinced that his HIV diagnosis made him a danger to others despite medical reassurances to the contrary. Dr. Patricia Williams, the trauma therapist assigned to his case, noted in her files that Marcus exhibited classic symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder and was at high risk for self-harm. On July 8th, 3 days before jury selection was scheduled to begin, Marcus disappeared. David woke up to find his son's bed empty, a note on the pillow that simply read, "I'm sorry for everything. I love you, Dad." Marcus had taken his father's truck and driven to Miller's Lake, the same place where Rebecca had assaulted him 2 months earlier. A jogger found him the next morning, sitting on the dock with his feet in the water, staring at the sunrise. When police approached, Marcus didn't resist. He'd been there all night, he told them, thinking about his mother and what she would want him to do. "She'd want me to be brave," Marcus said. "She'd want me to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Marcus's disappearance sparked a community-wide search that ended with relief when he was found safe. But the incident highlighted the severe psychological toll the case was taking on him. David made the difficult decision to check Marcus into a residential treatment facility for trauma recovery, postponing the trial until his son was stable enough to testify. Rebecca's lawyer used the delay to argue that Marcus's mental health issues undermined his credibility, suggesting that his breakdown proved he was unstable and possibly delusional. The legal maneuvering was ruthless, with both sides preparing for a trial that would determine not just Rebecca's fate, but the public's understanding of sexual abuse, HIV criminalization, and the nature of consent. During his month in residential treatment, Marcus slowly began to heal. He worked with therapists who specialized in trauma recovery and connected with other survivors of sexual assault. For the first time since prom night, Marcus began to understand that what happened to him wasn't his fault, that Rebecca's actions were those of a predator who'd carefully planned her attack. He learned about grooming behaviors and realized that Rebecca had been manipulating him for months before the assault. The knowledge was both liberating and heartbreaking, as Marcus recognized how thoroughly he'd been deceived by someone he'd trusted completely. When he returned home in late August, Marcus was determined to face Rebecca in court and tell his story, no matter how difficult it might be. The trial of Rebecca Walsh began on September 12th in the county courthouse, an imposing brick building that had seen few cases as sensational as this one. Marcus took the stand on the third day, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was describing. He looked directly at the jury as he recounted the events of prom night, the grooming that preceded it, and the devastating aftermath of his assault. Rebecca's lawyer tried to shake his testimony with aggressive cross-examination, but Marcus held firm. When asked why he hadn't immediately reported what happened, Marcus gave an answer that silenced the courtroom. "She was supposed to protect me. She was my mother figure. When someone you trust that much hurts you, it takes time to understand that what happened was real and that it wasn't your fault." The medical evidence was overwhelming. DNA analysis confirmed that Marcus had contracted HIV from Rebecca, with genetic sequencing showing that the virus strains were nearly identical. Dr. Chen testified about the timeline of infection and the rarity of HIV transmission through the type of assault Marcus described, emphasizing that Rebecca's knowledge of her status made her actions particularly egregious. The prosecution also presented evidence of Rebecca's internet searches in the weeks before prom, including queries about HIV transmission rates and symptoms of acute infection. The digital trail painted a picture of someone who had carefully researched the potential consequences of her planned assault and proceeded anyway. Rebecca's defense rested on character witnesses who testified about her volunteer work and devotion to her family, and expert witnesses who questioned the reliability of adolescent testimony in sexual assault cases. Rebecca herself took the stand in her own defense, tearfully maintaining her innocence and claiming that Marcus had misinterpreted an innocent conversation in the car after prom. She suggested that Marcus's HIV infection came from another source, perhaps from drug use or consensual sexual activity with peers. The performance was convincing to some observers, but the physical evidence and Marcus's detailed, consistent testimony proved more compelling to the jury. On September 28th, after deliberating for just under 6 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts: sexual assault, reckless endangerment, and criminal transmission of HIV. Rebecca showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but David, sitting in the victim's family section, broke down in tears. Marcus, now 18 and legally able to speak to the media, gave a brief statement on the courthouse steps. "I hope that other survivors know they can speak up and be believed. What happened to me was wrong, but staying silent would have been worse." The conviction carried a potential sentence of 30 years in prison, effectively a life sentence for the 40-year-old Rebecca. But the story didn't end with Rebecca's conviction. 2 weeks before her scheduled sentencing, while she was being held in the county jail awaiting the hearing, Rebecca was found dead in her cell. The official cause of death was ruled suicide by hanging, with a makeshift noose fashioned from torn bedsheets. She'd left no note, no final explanation for her actions or expression of remorse for the lives she'd destroyed. Her death robbed Marcus and David of the opportunity to see justice fully served and left unanswered questions about her motivations and whether she'd victimized others before Marcus. The anticlimactic end to the case left the community struggling to process not just Rebecca's crimes, but her final act of avoiding accountability. David and Marcus worked to rebuild their relationship in the aftermath of the trial and Rebecca's death. The shared trauma had brought them closer in some ways, but it had also highlighted how much they'd both been deceived by someone they'd trusted completely. David carried immense guilt about his failure to protect his son, while Marcus struggled with survivor's guilt and the ongoing challenge of managing his HIV diagnosis. They moved out of the house on Maple Street, unable to live surrounded by memories of Rebecca's presence. The new house was smaller but felt safer, a place where they could begin healing without constant reminders of their betrayal. Marcus enrolled in community college rather than the 4-year university he'd originally planned to attend, wanting to stay close to home while he recovered from his trauma. He became an advocate for other survivors of sexual assault, speaking at high schools about recognizing predatory behavior and the importance of reporting abuse. His message was simple but powerful. Survivors are not responsible for their victimization, and speaking up is an act of courage, not betrayal. Marcus's advocacy work helped him process his own experience while potentially protecting other young people from similar crimes. His strength in the face of such devastating betrayal inspired others and helped change conversations about male survivors of sexual assault. The case had broader implications for the community and the legal system. Millfield implemented new training for school personnel about recognizing grooming behaviors and reporting suspicious relationships between adults and minors. The county prosecutor's office used the case as a teaching tool for other jurisdictions about prosecuting HIV transmission crimes and supporting teenage victims of sexual assault. Rebecca's crimes had shattered one family and traumatized an entire community, but the response to her actions created systems and awareness that might prevent similar tragedies in the future. As we reach the end of Marcus's story, it's impossible not to feel the weight of what one person's selfish, criminal actions can do to destroy so many lives. Marcus Thompson was 17 years old when Rebecca Walsh, the woman he trusted as a mother figure, sexually assaulted him and knowingly exposed him to HIV. He was betrayed by someone who was supposed to protect him, infected with a life-altering virus, and traumatized in ways that will affect him for the rest of his life. Rebecca's decision to take her own life, rather than face the consequences of her actions, denied Marcus and David the closure they deserved, and left questions about her motivations forever unanswered. But Marcus's story is also one of survival and strength. Despite everything he endured, he found the courage to speak up, to seek help, and to ensure that Rebecca faced justice for her crimes. His decision to become an advocate for other survivors has already helped numerous young people recognize dangerous situations and report abuse. Marcus transformed his trauma into a mission to protect others, demonstrating a resilience that honors his mother's memory and his father's love. His journey from victim to survivor to advocate shows that even the most devastating betrayals don't have to define our futures. The case raises uncomfortable questions about how well we really know the people closest to us and how predators use positions of trust to access and harm vulnerable individuals. Rebecca Walsh appeared to be a loving stepmother and community member, but she was carefully grooming Marcus for months before her assault. The warning signs were subtle and easily dismissed as caring behavior, highlighting how sophisticated predators can be in hiding their true intentions. It makes you wonder, how many other Rebecca Walshes are out there, living double lives and waiting for the right opportunity to strike? This story also illustrates the complex trauma experienced by male survivors of sexual assault, particularly when the perpetrator is a woman in a position of authority. Marcus faced not only the physical and emotional trauma of his assault, but also societal skepticism about his victimization and the additional burden of an HIV diagnosis. His struggle to be believed and supported reflects the broader challenges faced by male survivors who often encounter different forms of victim blaming and minimization of their experiences. Marcus's courage in speaking up despite these obstacles paved the way for other young men to come forward about their own experiences of abuse. As you think about Marcus's story, consider how you would have handled the situation if you were in his position. Would you have had the strength to tell your father about the betrayal, knowing it would destroy your family? Would you have been able to testify in court, facing your attacker and reliving the trauma in front of strangers? And if you were David, how would you have processed the guilt of bringing a predator into your son's life, of missing the signs that might have prevented such devastation? These aren't easy questions, but they're important ones as we consider how to better protect vulnerable individuals and support survivors of sexual assault. The ripple effects of Rebecca's crimes extended far beyond Marcus and David to include their extended family, friends, neighbors, and the entire Millfield community. Everyone who knew and trusted Rebecca had to grapple with the reality that they'd been deceived by a skilled manipulator. The case forced difficult conversations about how predators operate, how to